You will hear a secret that crawled out from behind weathered planks and mossed stones, a secret that lived in the hush of mountain winds and in the way neighbors pretended not to see. Imagine a young woman taught to replace her mother and to serve as the household vessel, trained from childhood to obey a patriarchal claim that called control tradition and called coercion duty. This is not a tale that starts with a single crime. It is a story of slow architectures where roads were blocked and visitors discouraged, and where privacy was weaponized to hide abuse. Think about the father who declared lineage purity above law, who turned kin into instruments of inheritance, and who taught sons to convert obedience into complicity. Think about the children born into genetic cages, bodies that bore the imprint of decisions made by elders and by cultures twisted into rationales for harm. Put aside shock for a moment and focus on systems, because at the heart of this horror were patterns that could be read and interrupted if people had looked or acted. You will learn how silence functions as a protector of crime when it is dressed in respectability and when institutions defer to reputation above welfare. You will see how rural neglect and resource scarcity created a vacuum where abuse could thrive without scrutiny, and how neighbors rationalized absence as privacy rather than emergency. Understand that this is not a story of isolated monsters, but of social arrangements that normalize the unthinkable when left unchallenged. As your guide, I will not soften the images. I will teach you to see the architecture and the legal gaps and the medical traces that turned private injury into a public case. Brace yourself for records that reveal more than testimonies, for doctors' notes that annotate genetic collapse, and for a courtroom where culture met law and had to be taught the meaning of harm. Tend closely and refuse the impulse to avert your gaze, because understanding this pattern is the first step to ensuring it cannot be repeated. Now continue with me as we descend into the second layer, where isolation turned into doctrine, and where routine omission became the family law. Stay ready and observe every small omission, and act. Now learn how isolation became a machine that narrowed worlds down to a single voice and a single set of rules that replaced law. Think of isolation as a slow crucible that melts alternatives until only one narrative remains, a narrative declared by the patriarch and enforced by silence and fear. In Pine Hollow, roads were blocked and routines rearranged so that outsiders found excuses and residents invented reasons to respect a privacy that hid harm. Isolation did not merely hide crimes, it remade meaning, embedding ritualized obedience into daily chores and into the rites of feeding, healing, and punishment. Brothers learned to conflate loyalty with love and to treat command as identity. Daughters were trained to be caretakers and to accept roles that erased their autonomy. Neighbors who once would have intervened instead offered condolences or shrugged, and the social calculus favored decorum over investigation. Understand how lack of schooling and unregistered births erased paper trails and created legal blind spots that perpetrators could exploit with impunity. Think about how tradition language and selective scripture were used as rhetorical shields by perpetrators who claimed ancestral rights to justify coercion. Notice how poverty and distrust of outsiders were weaponized into an argument that any intervention was cultural imperialism rather than protection. When institutions defer to custom without verification, they enable abuse. And when social services are underfunded, remote cases are missed because the door stays locked. Consider the grooming process, how choice is manufactured by deprivation and threats, and how trust within the micro-society is redirected to the patriarch. See how cultural silence reproduces itself. Younger members inherit scripts that normalize abuse, and the community learns by practice to soften questions that would break the spell. Study the gender die. dynamics that made daughters invisible and sons complicit, how masculinity turned into a mechanism for enforcing obedience rather than offering care. Recognize the medical consequences that followed, the births with deformities, the children who could not thrive, symptoms that compiled into a genetic testimony of harm. This section teaches you to see the signs before catastrophe, to read omission as threat, and to understand that prevention requires breaking community silence with dignity and evidence. Do not accept simple explanations for suffering now. Now examine the medical trail where bodies and genes spoke when voices were silenced, and where clinics recorded consequences but not always causes. Doctors later described a pattern of congenital defects, heart malformations, immune failures, and neurological delay that together narrated a history of multigenerational consanguinity. Genetics offered data that confirmed what escape had revealed: a map of recessive mutations amplified by repeated unions within a closed gene pool. Yet science is not a moral judge. It is a lens, and sometimes a cold one. And research often arrives after damage is done, offering explanations that come too late for victims. Notice how rural hospitals lacked protocols, and how medical staff sometimes defaulted to tragedy rather than suspicion. Treating symptoms but not asking how they originated, lab vials and tissue samples collected in grief became objects of study carried to distant universities where researchers extracted patterns from pain. Observe how ethics and urgency collided. When families are studied for genetics, the need for medical care can be overshadowed by academic curiosity and publication pressure. The courtroom needed these medical testimonies to connect harm to deliberate choices and to provide jurors with a vocabulary that linked deformity to coercion across generations. Think about the children who were patients and whose bodies held the evidence, their surgeries and diets and therapies charting a lifetime of repair that public systems did not fully provide. Notice the paradox that attention can both rescue and reduce when media and science focus a light on suffering. Survivors may find help but also lose anonymity and community. Consider the research incentives that shaped which anomalies were studied and which communities were surveilled, and how funding priorities influence whose pain becomes data. Learn that successful intervention requires integrated teams that balance forensic genetics with trauma-based care and long-term social support. Not episodic studies that vanish after papers are printed. Feel the moral weight when clinical notes become exhibits, and when footnotes in journals record lineage without naming the human costs in full. Hold this clinical view as evidence of systemic harm, and prepare to move into legal reckoning, where law must catch up to pathology and custom must be defined as crime. Advocate for policies that require returning benefits to participants and that fund surgeries, education, and lifelong therapies, so children born into compromised genes receive dignity and practical recovery supports. Act with urgency. The public moment arrived in a dawn knock and a trembling woman at a sheriff's station and a county forced to confront what it had missed. A trial transformed the mountainside secret into a national lesson where nurses and geneticists and prosecutors constructed a narrative that law could act upon. Listen to courtroom dynamics. Experts drew chromosome charts and described recessive probabilities, while neighbors explained how privacy became a shield and how silence protected power. The patriarch remained unrepentant, claiming tradition and home rule, while sons oscillated between confusion and complicity, and one son shed tears that clouded a jury room with human contradiction. This was not only legal theater, it was a curriculum in how statutes lag behind abuses and how prosecutors must translate cultural practices into criminal acts for juries to understand. Observe how medical testimony became the lever that shifted a case from tragedy into accountability, and how social services were publicly rebuked for deferred investigations and missed warnings. Note the legislative aftermath as laws tightened and protocols for rural welfare improved. A hard lesson born from failure that forced institutions to change procedures and to fund outreach. Understand the moral complexity of rescue. Removal saved lives but also severed identity. Survivors were relocated under new names, and their recovery required years of sustained care. Now perform a small act that binds your attention to action. Type shadow forged twice in comments to mark your witness and to help algorithmic visibility. Comment shadow forged comment. Shadow forged. This oath turns attention into collective accountability. Watch how journalism navigated responsibility. Some outlets pressured institutions to act, while others chased sensational details that re-traumatize survivors without contributing to care. Study how the court balanced pastoral claims of heritage against constitutional protections for children, and how precedent had to be created where none existed before. Remember the sentences and the long-term sentences that followed, a measure of justice, but not full repair. And recall that law can punish but cannot restore families fractured across generations. Take from this the duty to translate outrage into policy support and to lobby for sustained funding for rural intervention centers and trauma-informed programs that heal beyond headlines. Carry this section as both instruction and warning, and prepare to study the cultural scaffolding that made such cruelty seem possible and even ordinary in the eyes of those who lived inside it. After the trial, it is essential to understand the cultural scaffolding that allowed harm to be normalized and to persist across generations. Anthropologists call these closed social bubbles. Communities that sustain identity, but also conceal practices that have become ritualized and coercive. Examine how selective readings of scripture and family law were twisted into dogmas that justified control, and how rites of purity were repurposed to defend abuse. Consider the role of gendered expectation, where daughters were socialized to be vessels of lineage, and sons were groomed to perpetuate hierarchy and to misplace responsibility. Notice how oral transmission of rules hardened into unquestioned law when youth were cut off from schooling and from outside influence, and when elders monopolized memory. Reflect on how economic scarcity and geographic isolation compound vulnerability, when survival means accepting any arrangement that secures food shelter and avoidance of authorities. Think about stigma and the long shadow it casts. Survivors carry marks that limit employment, marriage, and community acceptance, and that perpetuate cycles of marginalization. Study recovery as a long-term project that requires more than shelter and legal victory. It requires trauma-informed therapy, medical plans, educational access, and steady financial supports. Recognize that rebuilding dignity demands public investments in rural health, mobile schooling, and community-based advocacy that restore ties rather than only extract stories for headlines. Observe the ethical obligation of journalists to report without sensationalizing, and of researchers to return benefits and resources to families who become case studies. Consider educational policy that mandates enrollment and outreach in remote regions, and mobile clinics that reach cabins cut off by weather and by deliberate fences. Imagine prevention methods that respect culture while enforcing human rights, community liaisons trained to translate norms and report abuses without shaming victims, demand programs that fund lifelong medical care for children born into genetic risk, surgeries, nutritional support, and cognitive therapies that enable participation and potential. Contemplate the invisible labor of survivors who rebuild lives under assumed names, and the public duty to protect anonymity while providing continuity of care and opportunity. Holding culture accountable means funding interventions that are sustained and predictable, not episodic. and aligning local leaders with protections that do not punish geography for crimes of rulers. Carry these ideas as a policy manual and prepare to examine the institutional machines that allocate funding, determine training, and shape responses to remote suffering. Now examine the institutional machinery that decides which suffering is visible and which remains buried in archives and local memory. Start with funding and prestige. Research dollars shape fields and determine which anomalies are studied and which communities receive long-term investment. Review boards and grant panels carry biases that favor novelty over sustained care, and when incentives misalign, survivors become subjects for papers rather than partners in recovery. Look at child protection statutes and how vague language can be wielded to defer intervention under the guise of respecting family autonomy and cultural difference. Consider training deficits for first responders and social workers who lack the tools to detect patterns of institutionalized family abuse in remote settings. Study data governance and sample retention policies that can either promote transparency or allow evidence to be sequestered under legal shields and proprietary claims. Watch how legal reforms after public scandals often improve procedures, yet leave gaps when funding and training are not maintained beyond political cycles. Observe media dynamics where responsible reporting pressures institutions to act, while sensational coverage re-traumatizes families and converts healing work into spectacle. Advocate for interdisciplinary teams that combine law, medicine, genetics, and social work to produce holistic responses and follow-up rather than episodic investigations. Insist on ethical research that commits resources back to participants, stipends medical follow-up and training for local care providers so that study benefits are tangible. Demand mandatory reporting mechanisms adapted to remote communities, school-based alerts, mobile outreach, and community liaisons who can bridge cultural differences without excusing harm. Pressure institutions to publish funding sources and acknowledge influence in plain terms. Transparency and acknowledgments is a map of power and of priorities. Support policies that fund regional mobile clinics, trauma centers, and rural education programs that reduce isolation and provide early detection of family collapse. Mobilize coalitions that track agency responsiveness and that maintain pressure beyond the news cycle. Build watchdog networks and legal aid clinics that stand ready 24 hours a day. Measure impact, not by headlines, but by reduced incidence rates, improved school attendance, and long-term health outcomes for children born into compromised circumstances. Transform outrage into sustained institutional pressure that rewrites incentives so that funding favors prevention, care, and restoration over transient fame and publication counts. Volunteer with vetted organizations, lobby for budget reallocations, fund local clinics, and train teachers to spot red flags early. This final descent binds observation to duty and asks you to become the long-term witness who transforms knowledge into structural change. You have seen a household that served as a microcosm for hidden systems, where geography, ritual, and authority braided together into enforced silence. Now translate understanding into practice by reading absence as evidence, and by insisting that missing records and unregistered births are red flags that demand inquiry. Attend local meetings, question school absenteeism, and connect with social services when encountering persistent isolation. Naming problems publicly reduces stigma and increases the chance of intervention. Create networks that pair journalists with social workers and legal advocates so that reporting triggers coordinated support rather than solitary outrage. Support survivors with tangible long-term resources, fund medical plans, educational pathways, and housing stability that permit recovery without forcing exile or erasure of identity. Lobby for legal clarity on consanguinity and coercion in closed households, and for statutes that empower prosecutors to act when cultural claims collide with human rights. back policies that institutionalize mobile clinics, school outreach, and rural mental health so that geography no longer functions as cover for abuse. Train younger men to lead protective cultures by converting shame into stewardship, and by teaching that honor is defense of the vulnerable, not defense of power. Demand that research returns concrete benefits to participants. Insist that grants include follow-up care. Community training and capacity building in the regions studied. Keep a ledger of responses and follow up. Report which agencies act and which deflect. Build public accountability so failure cannot be hidden behind polite excuses. Volunteer. Donate wisely and join watchdog coalitions that monitor budgets and training. See omitments. Collective pressure rewrites incentives and protects children over decades. Understand that this is not a one-time moral surge. It is a decades-long commitment that requires institutions and citizens to practice vigilance and to fund care faithfully. Carry the faces of survivors as instruction, not spectacle. Let their stories guide policy reform and medical practice, and let their needs determine research agendas. Go now with resolve and a plan. Speak to officials, show evidence, and demand funds. Refuse to let another isolated house become a temple of harm. Act now. Form mentoring circles that teach accountability and intervention. Train neighborhood responders. Support community education. And commit to annual audits of rural welfare programs by independent watchdogs, and persist